What is up, Rad Potential YouTube? I'm Mr. Rad, and I'm here in sunny California with the man, the myth, the legend, Kyle Mohan himself. And we're going to talk to you guys about building a Turbo RX8 RX8. So this isn't the hybrid, which will be in a future video. This is just, we want a turbo in RX8. What are the horsepower limitations? And like, what can you expect out of a Turbo RX8? Because I know a lot of people are like, they're fragile, you're going to blow it up. And it's just, in my head, it's not an FD. This isn't 1995 with a T78 turbo and a Power FC and 500 horsepower. It's a very different, in every sense of the fashion, engine than an REW or an RX-7 at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everything you said was correct right there. Yeah, I think it's always a matter of expectations. Everybody comes at the RX-8 wishing they had an FD3S or a Turbo RX-7. And just understanding that it really is a different 13B engine fundamentally to start with. Although we can get away with changing or interchanging a lot of the parts, it was really designed as a NA engine, and the fundamentals of it are a little hard to get around. But we have had some success boosting them. And very early on when the RX-8 came out, I think it was everybody's goal to figure out how to either supercharge it, turbocharge it, and make it like its siblings. You know, everybody loves that from the rotary engine, and we did learn a lot. And I think there are ways to have some really successful boosted Renesis setups.
I want to give you a brief overview of an RX8 and then a few things that Kyle and I are going to talk about. One of the things when you sit down with the experts is you kind of lose track of the basics. So I'm going to give you guys the basics of setting up a Turbo RX8 and some of the off-the-shelf options that you can buy to put your RX8 into a configuration like this to just make it not the slowest car on the planet. So this car in particular is Buzz, the 2004 Lightning Yellow RX8, Buzz Lightyear is what I like to call him. And this is a low compression engine. So this engine has been hurt, but this is just a bone stock, unopened Renesis engine, or at least it might have been rebuilt at some point. So much like a car you would have bought, okay? This engine on the dyno made 130 horsepower NA, and it was super slow. So I wanted to boost it, right? We can blow this engine up, don't care, needs your build anyways. Let's learn about turbos. So that's the whole premise behind this car. That's why it's a little bit ragtag. But the bones are good. So you go buy an RX8 that runs and you want to turbo it. A couple different options for turbo kits. GRY made kits back in the day. You have the Pettit Racing Supercharger kit. You've got Brett Speed makes a kit. I think RX8 Performance makes a turbo kit. And there's varying locations of turbo. So where my turbo is, this is called a top mount turbo. Most of those other kits are bottom mount turbos, which means they're gonna put the turbo way down there under the intake manifold. There's pros and cons to each of those, but just know top mount versus bottom mount turbo setup. With regards to managing heat in a high compression engine and the turbo kit itself, right? So like the GRY low mount turbo versus some of the kits that put the turbo up higher, like where or how should we consider managing the exhaust temperature with, you know, a high compression setup?
I think it's very important. And I mean, you look at some of the available kits out there and they were good starting points. Again, managing expectations with the GRY low mount kit, it had limitations. And the way it came, at the time, it was already somewhat expensive for the industry and really needed a lot more work and a lot more tuning capacity. But at an entry point, having that low mount turbo fundamentally worked. I wish we had access to those manifolds at this point because they were kind of neat the way they hid the turbo, made everything somewhat of a factory package. We ran into issues managing some of the temperature though with the turbo and manifolding down there, and this is common throughout RX8 turbocharging. But having the turbo and everything down there very close to the intake manifold and very close to the metering pump. We had some issues with the metering pump getting too hot and with intake manifold air temperatures getting hot, but also being hard to calculate and manage because of the fact that the heat was coming in right as it was going down into the motor. So I don't blame the GRY kit for that. We were able to get around it with heat shielding, ceramic coating, and bringing in some fresh air to that area with some ducting and just flow through the engine bay. But I think that if you're going to look at whether there's more potential with a top mount or raised up turbo versus a low mount. I think having one that's more available in the engine bay, has more space around it, allowing heat to disperse, allowing the manifold to have a better design potentially, all to me lead to better performance. So in most cases where people went with their own designs or tubular or more of a front mount turbo, it seemed like you got rid of some of those heat soak issues and you had more turbo choice availability. But it really depended on what you want. Like I said, if I could get my hands on one of those little GRY manifolds at a cheap price, it was such a great starting point. And, you know, realistically, if you're not trying to run a lot of boost, that was fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I know at 7 stock, I was looking at all the different Turbo RX8 setups, and once you've kind of chosen where you're going to put the turbo, ultimately is going to like complicate or uncomplicate. There's a sacrifice in each location. So like bottom mount, you're going to have a lot of heat in that lower intake manifold. You go top mount, now you've got to get the MAF sensor somewhere if you're using a MAF, or if you go to a standalone, or intercooler piping. So everything kind of has its complications. And once you've chosen that, now the next limiting factor ultimately, I think, isn't necessarily, you know, the turbo as much as like once you start pushing these engines, the intake manifold's pretty restrictive for going to a boosted setup. It's made of plastic. So I know in your guys' situation, the Pettit Racing, they used to make a supercharger kit, and it came with this really trick upper intake manifold that kind of helped eliminate some of those issues. So what would you say as far as once you've chosen your turbo, the location, you kind of have your intercooler sorted, you've got some heat shielding in there, that like as a stock RX8 owner, you should look for as the next step to, you know, ultimately my goal with a Turbo RX8 is like 300 horsepower or 330 or something like that. You're never going to get like 500 out of a stock Renesis. It's just not going to happen. So, you know, to achieve that number reliably, 300 horsepower, are there other things we should look at upgrading? Just, you know, stock RX8 wise?
Yeah, I think you were already kind of leading into it. If you've got your turbocharging and management and fuel and the basics kind of going there, at some point the intake manifolding and throttle body are a basic restriction. They are limiting a factor, and with the plastic intake manifold, you do have to worry about how much boost pressure that can handle. And the overall fatigue of it. So for us going to an aluminum upper intake manifold, being able to port all of that, clean it up, eliminate the actuators, so making it more of a traditional rotary flow setup, helped us out and got us further along in different applications we were doing. But it's also similar to when you look at like how people would boost early RX7 6-port engines, or if they were tying the twin turbos of an FD3S together to make them non-sequential. When you start to eliminate some of that factory actuation and what the computer could do, you start to lose a little bit of bottom end, but in most cases you're going for way bigger gains because of boost, because of driving style or performance ideas on the top end. So going to a bigger throttle body, going to an aftermarket or custom-made intake manifold, I think are progressive points, but I don't know that you actually need to do that to get a Renesis into that high 200, low 300 horsepower range. I think the limiting factors there are more inherent with the porting of the engine and its ability to move air through in total, and then the compression ratio of the rotors per what octane you're running and fuel delivery. I think that generally speaking, we saw most even very aggressive Renesis setups with porting, you know, intake manifold modifications, single turbo setup, you know, higher octane than pump gas. And they were still running into EGT limitations, boost per horsepower, where you can see that you're adding more and more boost, but you're not getting the horsepower gains you should see. So obviously the efficiency of the engine or the package is dropping off. And that usually happened in that 300 to 370 horsepower range. And then block fatigue becomes a big thing at that point. For me, I really feel like if I were to run a Renesis block in its stock form, I wouldn't feel safe probably going over the 5 to 7 psi range.
Sure.
And even going to 10 could potentially cause block failure, not even because of any inherent issues. It's just high compression and not an inherently boost designed block. But there's workarounds for all of this. And
one of the questions I asked Kyle was, has he broken an iron from too much horsepower? And what I mean by that is, in a rotary engine where your housings and irons all go together, you have tension bolts that go around the outside that clamp the engine together. In order to prevent the engine from twisting apart, you have these dowels, and they fit up here and down there. And you slide the housings on, and the dowels keep everything lined up nice and happy, all hunky-dory. When you make a ton of power, you're going to be trying to rip these dowels apart, just to shear them off. But what happens is the dowel is actually stronger than the iron. So my buddy Ernie at Phalanx Performance has a really sick Turbo RX8, and he's been ripping on it for years and years. And he's like the testament to why I built my RX8 the way I did. So I'm gonna insert a couple clips of his car right here. So as you can tell, his car rips, okay? Making just under 300 horsepower on basically the same turbo, I carbon copied his turbo setup for the yellow car. Aside from like the nice trick downpipe and recirculated wastegate, and I just went the lazy route with the hood exit and whatnot. But anyways, his car is the inspiration for mine, and what he's been breaking in his car is the front iron. So right around this dowel landing area on the front iron, there's a thin spot, and he cracks it, and then it'll start spraying oil out. These upper dowels are actually an oil passageway from the front to the back of the engine. So when you break one of them, oil just goes everywhere. It's real unfortunate. You can block this off, you can run an external line. There's many different ways around like running a cracked iron, so it's not quite the end of the world. And fortunately enough, RX8 parts are pretty easy to get, so you can get a replacement iron. But Ernie has literally broken 3 front irons in his car. He runs aftermarket apex seals and a bridge-ported Renesis, and the thing rips, and it's been nothing but reliable for him except for just breaking that front iron, which for somebody who isn't, me or Ernie or Kyle, when you blow up your motor and you're not a mechanic and you have to take it to the shop, well, having to have your engine pulled and just to have a front iron put on, which is going to be a few $100s just for the iron, there's like a couple $1,000s worth of labor in that. So it's a little unfortunate that that's the weak link, but when you do turn them down a little bit, stay around that 250, 260 horsepower mark, you most likely, I can't say you won't, but you most likely won't see breaking front irons all the time. As, Ernie, me, Kyle, we like to turn our stuff up. We're the shop owner. We can kind of break our own cars all the time and still be able to fix them. So for what it's worth, you can break a front iron if you're trying to do RX-7 things with your RX-8. Yeah.
A 5 PSI, boosting a Renesis to 5 or 7 PSI feels great.
Oh yeah.
It totally wakes the car up, changes the driving, and I recommend it.
Yeah, for sure. And that's one of the biggest things that I've learned, as we go down the turbo, turbo Renesis avenue is exactly what we said at the beginning of the video, is managing expectations. And it's just that this engine is not an REW. It's not designed for this. So you don't want to go in with the goal of something crazy, because it's ultimately not going to work. And I think a lot of people, and myself included, overcomplicate these builds with we need an aluminum intake manifold, and I'm afraid of the top mount because of this, or I'm afraid of the low mount because of this. And to me, it's I think you just put whatever you can find together on a stock Renesis, or even put some upgraded apex seals in it and just put it in there. Yeah. And tune it to 7 PSI and go. Because at the point of, you guys were pushing these as hard as possible, but we don't really, we know where the failure point is, so why even try to push it? Just build something and have fun. And I think it's going to make, a turbo, like the yellow car, the Turbo RX8, if it makes 220, 250, 260 wheel, that's going to be a blast of a car to drive. And ultimately, I think the RX8's the best RX car, fight me in the comments, but it's the best RX car definitely to drive. It definitely has in my opinion, chassis-wise, a bit more performance potential than a lot of the other ones, and they're just a really fun, budget, good car.
I love RX8s. And now that we're talking about it, I think it reminds me of just how much fun we had testing the GRY Turbo Kit.
Yeah.
Now, roughly 20 years ago, 18 years ago. But it really was, because suddenly that car made all the right noises. Fundamentally, it's a good chassis, good brakes. It's a good car. And having, at that point, it was like 5 to 6 PSI. I think we were trying to get more out of it, and we weren't able to. Was actually really fun. And, once we got it into the 7, 8 PSI, we started to run out of OEM fuel delivery potential. And that's where you start to tinker, you start to mess with stuff, and you start to break stuff. But in that original low boost trim, I think it was a very acceptable package. For sure. But everybody at that point was used to an FD3S or a Turbo 2 that from the factory had boost. And at that point, we were raising boost levels to 10, 14, 20 PSI, and that's what people wanted. But I think probably modify, if you have the motor apart, I would street port it. Nothing more aggressive than that. And I would probably deepen the apex seal grooves just to have more beam strength. Not that that's going to protect you from detonation inherently, but you could choose an apex seal that has detonation protection in it.
I had these rotors machined for an RX-7 apex seal instead of an RX-8 apex seal. The reason to do that is an RX-7 apex seal is huge. It's almost 2 times the height of an RX-8 apex seal. So let me show you. This is an RX-8 apex seal, which you can see is super skinny, and this is an RX-7 apex seal, which is much taller. So you can see a little bit of height difference there. The reason to do that is because this apex seal from the RX-7 is much stronger than the apex seal in an RX-8. So you're gonna have a higher risk of breaking an apex seal due to detonation with the RX-8 apex seal over the RX-7 apex seal. Now, you can simply buy an aftermarket set of apex seals for your RX-8 that's stronger than OEM to help resist that detonation as well. But if you are wanting to just turbo a stock RX-8 engine, know that the apex seals are a little small, and this is where we're always gonna talk about managing expectations. One of the reasons your RX-8 is not an RX-7 engine, has to be treated a little differently, is because of that right there. The apex seals are literally half as tall from the factory.
And I think other than that, there's not a lot you're going to do to really inherently make the RX-8 block like an FD block. A 300 horsepower RX-8 that makes all the good noises is a very good goal for people at this point. And it's very doable.
For sure. And it's one of those things where like that can be a very, very reliable car at 300 horsepower. You're not going to be breaking stuff all the time, and it's not a track car at that point. You'd have to do a little bit more to get it trackable. But as a good fun street car to go out and like try to keep up with Karen and the 5.0 Mustang and like the 350Zs and making it less a 150 horsepower car and more of like an actual fun RX-7-esque sports car. I think like Turbo RX-8, you shouldn't be scared of it. Understand that 300 to 350 horsepower should be like the max of what you can ultimately do. And like, I think, tune into our hybrid video, which we're going to talk about next, is trying to push the Renesis block like further than a Renesis block should honestly probably be pushed. Past that 350 horsepower mark, the cost, like you could probably just REW swap it, and if you really want that big horsepower, and I don't really know that it's worth like dumping a ton of time and effort into making a Renesis try to reach that horsepower. We'll talk about that in the hybrid video, but it's a little bit of a whole different animal. So
hate me for saying it and agreeing, but I absolutely agree. I think if your goal is to just make some more power with an RX-8, then 5 PSI a boost, 7 PSI a boost, enjoy it. If you're gonna get wild, 10 PSI. But it's just not an FD motor. If you're searching for 400 to 600 horsepower, consider rotary swap options
for sure.
as a nominal value. But I think there's still so much fun to be had with these motors. And it's like you said, one of the reasons I played around with the Renesis and we started playing with the hybrid Renesis engine designs was because there's great parts here. They're available, and the chassis is a good chassis. I have a daily, I have a race car, we've built multiple race cars. Fundamentally, they're good cars. So let's all have fun with them.
Exactly. So with that, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys learned something. go check out Kyle Mohan Racing, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, all of that. He uploads videos. He's building this Formula Drift car back here, the RX-7 FD, which is going to be rad to see an FD out there.
I'm so excited.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always like, everybody's like, why are you now building the FD to go into Formula Drift? Well, it's always been my dream. I just couldn't afford it. And not that I could afford it now, but I'm getting older, so I figure I just better do it.
Exactly.
Like, I gotta force myself to do it.
Yeah, and it's perfect for the end of the video. Live a life you don't need a vacation from. You know, get out there and do the stuff you want to do that makes you happy. And,
absolutely.
I really appreciate Kyle for taking the time to share some knowledge. I know, you know, I don't have all the experience that he does, and I'm happy to share everything with you guys. So with that, keep it rad. We'll see you in the next one. Awesome.
Super cool.
Yeah, I think that'll be good.
Oh yeah. People are gonna love that topic, and it's a topic. Hit me up. We'll do another online conference about it afterwards, because I'm sure people will have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And it'd be so easy to get into more detail about, like, you know, working with the ECUs on the cars or working the fuel systems. The fact that it can't make a left turn with half a tank of gas.
Yep.
Stupid RX8s.
Yeah.